Viewers, welcome to another edition of a conversation that we've been meaning to have with you. We find ourselves in familiar territory. As the general elections draw closer, perhaps unsurprisingly, various elements have with renewed vigor begun to question the health of our polity. The idea is to play on insecurities and whip up a feeling that the NDA is leading us into a dark abyss of social strife and exclusion that will split the nation down the middle. These fears have been consistently expressed over the last 9 years, viewers. The overwhelming conclusion these people seem to have come to is that India's slide into an intolerant and insular Hindu Rashtra, because they make that conflation, is now just one more verdict away, one more election away. And that after the 2024 elections, the BJP, which they believe is set to return under Modi, with perhaps even a larger majority, will change the architecture of our republic and birth a Hindu state where minorities will be relegated to the margins, condemned to live a life of third-class citizens. Today we will speak to Dr. David Frawley, who is also known as Vamdev Shastri, to test this thesis. Dr. Frawley is a proponent of hindutva, and he believes that it is wrong to conflate the concept of a Hindu Rashtra with that of a Hindu Rajya, a veritable Hindu Pakistan. So let me begin this conversation. We've been waiting for a long time to have you in our studios, Dr. Frawley.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Many thanks for speaking to Times Now. There's much to discuss. But let me first begin by something that has been said by the Congress party, Rahul Gandhi, for example, during the course of his Bharat Jodo Yatra. Elements in our polity, intellectuals, etc., who are backed by the Congress, who are close to the Congress view of things. Rahul Gandhi said that, for example, anyone calling for a Hindu Rashtra is not even a Hindu. He must be punished. There are others who say that they must be booked for sedition because they're anti-nationals. Mm-hmm. And others have gone to another extreme extent to say that this kind of loose talk by the likes of Mohan Bhagwat, etc., will result in Muslim youth piping up and saying that we want a Muslim Rashtra. Is this a false equivalence to draw, Dr. Frawley?
It is a totally false equivalence, because if we look at the Hindu tradition, the Bharatiya tradition, including Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, etc., there was never the need or the demand to control and have one view and one party, one religion over all the others. There was a dharmic civilization that not only respected other people, but respected nature, all life is sacred, that was very connected to the land. And the idea of the Rashtra was not so much a modern political entity as a way of supporting the entire country, its ecosystem, its arts, its culture, abundance of trade. We cannot equate it with these modern political divisions.
Let me ask you, in your belief, is India on its way to becoming a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu Pakistan, as the opposition and many commentators, especially on the left, would have us believe?
Again, I think that is totally misleading. We have religious influences in all the countries of the world. We have dozens of Islamic states. We have many countries, even in Europe, which of course will support Christian ideas or Christian ethos. So different countries have their cultural backgrounds that affect things. But the Indian view was never one of conquering or converting other people. It was one of sharing their dharma and honoring their nature, honoring their art, their culture. Hindu dharma spread all the way through Indonesia. It influenced China, Japan. It was prominent in Central Asia for a long time. It did not have that imperial dominating view, but this idea of sharing a broader humanity.
The reason I asked you this is because there is a whole lot of people, let's call it the ecosystem, The ecosystem comes out and says that the signs are writ large. There are many people who are also saying that the BJP's term, the second iteration under Mr. Modi, has led to the birth of a Hindu Taliban in this country. They've all got very empowered. They're the ayatollahs of hindutva. And that these people are now completely out of control. They're like a Frankenstein monster. And you can see what they're doing. They're lynching Muslims. They're attacking others for their beliefs. They are making all sorts of derisive commentary about pogroms and this and that. And these people are never now going to be reined in. They're going to take us the way of Nazi Germany.
Yes, also basically misleading political propaganda. India is the largest democracy in the world. It has the greatest democracy, pluralism, and culture throughout Asia. Compare India to China. Compare India to Pakistan, Iran, so many countries there. India is prospering. India, remember, represents 1/6 of humanity. Its population is greater than Europe and North America put together, and yet it has greater diversity of language, culture. And even when we talk about Hinduism is not a uniform, proselytizing, world-dominating, controlling religion. It has been open to dharmic teachings on many levels, and it's not based simply upon belief. It is a culture. It is a way of life. It is Ayurveda. It is yoga. It is working with nature. It is temples that reflect nature. So there's no monotheistic or monolithic, you might say, Hindu theology, ideology for dominating, conquering the world, and there never has been. Also, we must recognize that Hindus are the least politically assertive of all the religious groups in the world, including probably in India.
Well, that's interesting, but I'll pick you up on that. But are you denying that there is a militant Hindu fringe, for example, that flexes its muscles in ways that may not be palatable to others, number one? Number two, is it today out of control? How do you respond to those who say that the government has no hold over them anymore? They're being mainstream. They're within the BJP. They're without the BJP, but they're there. And they make themselves felt even at election time.
Well, certainly you have cultural, religious views in all elections. India is a Hindu majority country, and I probably maybe sometimes say Nepal is, but it is the dominant voice of Hindu civilization. You have Muslim republics, you have Christian republics, you have communist rules. I think it's very important that India maintains a Bharatiya voice, honors its civilization, and honors its culture. What we're seeing today is a shadow of the Nehruvian era, because Nehruvian era disempowered India of being India. They wanted to turn it into socialism. They had strong Marxist influence. They did not honor the culture. Even a single temple really couldn't be rebuilt by them. So in that shadow, they're trying to project what they did as something better, and the attempts to remove their influence as intolerant. But they didn't have any particular tolerance going on there. And the greatest threats to tolerance and peace in Asia has always been the communist and the far left, whether China, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, India. So I think there's an attempt to discredit or demonize a political Hinduism, even though it's no different or even probably less than other religious influences, cultural influences in the political realm. And so I think it's like creating a monster and then pretending it's there.
Creating a monster and then pretending it's there. Okay, well, that's an interesting way of putting it. Now, Dr. Frawley, in October last year, praising Prime Minister for the work his government has undertaken in the construction of the Kashi Vishwanath Dham or the Mahakal corridor in Ujjain, you spoke of the importance of restoring temples and why it is important for a new India. You wrote, and let me quote you, "This new labor and sadhana of restoring and renovating important temples needs to go forward with the determination and confidence as part of a greater cultural unfoldment and civilizational affirmation for India as a whole, unquote.
Yes.
But what you wrote was more about renovation and restoration. What about reclamation through the revocation of the Places of Worship Act? Why do you believe the government has not yet taken a stand on this, for example, publicly?
Well, it is, of course, a political issue. It's a big issue, and it's something that was imposed some years ago. But no such act exists in any other country. For example, when the countries of Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary took off Islamic rule, they never created such a law like that. And even in the United States, Native Americans are also trying to reclaim some of their holy sites. So we have to put it in the proper context. And yet, remember, too, the Hindu temple is also a cultural monument, a historical monument. It is full of art, music, dance, architecture. So it is reflecting the heritage of the country. For example, in Greece, they restore ancient pagan Greek temples because they reflect where they came from. So India has that unusual context in which you had a culture and spiritual tradition of thousands of years. It was also meant to be independent. But after independence, the Nehruvian forces tried to suppress that in fear of their own political control and following a different vision of India. For them, India began in 1947, and for others, supposedly India was a creation of the British. You could have told that to the ancient Greeks who wrote texts like Indica. So that civilizational issue, India was not allowed to come up so much as a civilization. There was the attempt to just turn it into another modern nation state. But the world needs India to be India. There are all kinds of other countries in the world. And India has a great heritage for humanity. And Indic traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Yoga, Vedanta, Ayurveda, they've spread worldwide. You find at least some people in all the countries of the world who are honoring them. So India has to be looked in light of its heritage, its antiquity. And again, it represents 1/6 of humanity. It is not a country like Belgium or France or even the United States, 4 times the population of the United States and much more diversity.
Dr. Frawley, there has definitely been a Hindu awakening in the last few years, yes, especially under the NDA 2.0. Some people like to refer to it as that. How much has the Saffron Parivar, including the BJP, contributed to this, number one? Mm-hmm. Number two, yes, we have the politically conscious Hindu now, and you sort of also referred to that entity in our polity. Does she or he pose a threat to India's inherent pluralism and multicultural identity? 2 questions.
Yes. Well, of course, BJP and related other groups, cultural groups, Hindu groups, even educational groups, Sanskrit movement, yoga. Modi brought International Yoga Day. Modi is promoting Ayurveda. Modi is renovating sacred sites that are also historical sites. But why didn't India do that earlier? India is a country full of temples, and after independence, the government didn't bring any back. They even tried to stop Somnath. There was other groups that was able to bring the Somnath back. There were no real schools of Indic knowledge created. There was no real honoring. The Indian arts were turned into kind of a temporary cultural thing or museum pieces. There was an attempt to prevent the civilizational awakening of India. But the world was looking for the civilizational awakening of India. If people honored India, whether the intellectuals, the scholars of the world, they were looking at India's great traditions and the need for an Indian voice in civilization. We have a Chinese voice, we have a European voice, we have American voice. Without India You don't have a democracy in the world. You have the oldest, largest, perhaps, civilization not given a place or a voice. And what BJP has done under Modi is not just locally in India honoring the culture, but raising the status of India in the world stage, and India as India, not India as just another socialist country or Marxist country. And that rising of India has, of course, posed some threat to those who wanted India to stay down. So it's more complex than just that. And inside India, there was always the division of the vote. Hindu vote was divided, and then you take one aspect of the Hindus, align them with leftists or Muslims, then you have a majority for yourself. So the idea of Hindus voting in a more determined or a more even uniform way upset all the old political equations.
Let me ask you this, because you talk about this rejuvenation, etc. Now, the consecration of the Ram temple in Ayodhya by Prime Minister Modi, that happened a few years ago. And even its grand opening scheduled for 2024, the beginning of 2024 in the backdrop of the elections, has been called a requiem for a secular Indian ethos and the erection of a second republic gouged out of the book of hyper-nationalism and Hindu supremacism. This is what is being said.
Yes.
Now, what's your position on this? I mean, why should we be consecrating the symbols of only one faith, for instance?
Well, first of all, Ram is all over Asia, Indonesia, even Vietnam. The Ramayana was the most popular and well-known book throughout India, throughout Asia. Ram is also accepted by the Buddhist. So he is a global figure. And he also, again, represents the ancient culture. And Ayodhya represented that abandonment of India's traditions that the Nehruvian governments did. They couldn't even take Ram Janmabhoomi back, but they were quite happy to have a more socialist identity. So it's very important that India again reclaims India. Ram is the great symbol of dharma in India. And why should we be afraid of dharma? Again, most of the genocide and exploitation of the world was done by socialist and, of course, capitalist and, of course, colonialist and even missionaries.
So a dharmic nation, if we were to become a dharmic nation, we shouldn't conflate that idea with religion. It's a philosophy, it's a view on life.
We have to understand religion is a Western term. So many terms used to understand India don't apply, like right and left are Western terms. You'll also remember that whether you talk about Nazis, fascist, communist, colonialist, imperialist, these were all originally Europeans, and they were all product of European thought. So you have to understand India as India and allow India to have its own voice and its own critique. For example, we have many critiques of what's wrong with India. But India can also give a vision as to what's wrong with the world. Many great gurus, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, others, understood Western culture and could say what was good in it, but where it also had limitations. And when people come to India, it's to connect to those deeper spiritual dharmic traditions, not simply to promote their own socialist or whatever cultural values they have. Now,
a large number of people have been saying over the last few years that there is a powerful thrust, and it's propaganda basically, to suggest that Hindus are under attack and that there is rampant Hindu phobia, Hindumesia, call it what you want to, and this is being continually whipped up by the regime to justify the assertion of Hindu rights and identity here in India. Is this a concoction to provide cover for Hindu supremacism?
Well, let us look at the history. India has been the main target for religious conversion for centuries, and billions of dollars continue to be spent for that purpose. Now, if you go to academia, you will find Indic studies. You will find studies of India and in Hinduism also, but you'll rarely find a practicing Hindu there. Even in the United States, textbooks on Hinduism don't talk about yoga and Vedanta, they talk about caste. They don't mention the Hindu gurus who came to the West, and even though they made great contributions. And there's not a Hindu voice in the outside media either. There's many Islamic voices, for example. There's many Jewish voices. There are many political organizations worldwide supporting different religions, but there's actually probably more supporting the Sikhs than there are supporting the Hindus. The Hindu voice has not been there. And we also see that Hindus have often been portrayed in a negative light. Now, I come from the older generation, so it's interesting to see when we were children, we were told that Hindus were poor, unclean, superstitious, uneducated, and that they should be saved. I came from a Catholic background. Now, today, in the United States and even UK, we're saying Hindus have too much money, they're too well educated, they're getting too much power. So the scenario has changed, but the negativity is still there. Now, what's also happened is the Hindu diaspora globally has been very successful educationally, economically, not only in US, UK, Canada, but even as a general influence, prosperous. So there's a certain backlash of jealousy that has also come there. And so it's very interesting that the scenario has changed, the status of the Hindus, the influence of the Hindus has come up. In no country in the world is there a militant Hindu minority. They're not in prison, they're not on welfare, they're promoting peace, they're developing their communities. So the facts on the ground are very different. What we do see is the Hindus, and even India in general, has contributed a lot to science and medicine in the West. But some of the left-leaning social sciences have targeted the Hindus for that. And now there's a tendency to lump the Hindus along with the Jews, and also to kind of direct a kind of negative feelings against them for their success and for the fact that they overcame the stereotype. Can you imagine the Hindus being taught that you're superstitious and backward, having to come into science and all of that? Now it's the opposite. They're looking for their expertise in so many fields.
You said that obviously Hindus lack a voice, someone who sort of can amplify their point of view. The RSS, of course, is perhaps one of the few bodies that does so consistently. Now, over the last few years, it has struck a more reasonable and conciliatory pose towards minorities, especially if you hear Mohan Bhagwat, 2018, etc. Is this a deliberate reorientation, or is it that the Sangh has been deliberately misrepresented by its ideological opponents all these years for vested political interests?
Well, certainly there have been vested political interests all along, because if you divide the Hindu vote and you encourage the minorities to vote, then you can bring again the Nehruvian socialist idea of a state. And I don't want to go into all the controversies, but it's well known historically that a lot of the riots that occurred in India were instigated by not just the British, but later on by the Congress Party as well. Some may challenge me on that, but I think it's something that needs to be examined. So the Hindu vote was always a threat. And there are also many voices of Hindu Dharma. RSS has been the most notable, but even read what the great gurus said about India, like Sri Aurobindo, Vivekananda, Chinmayananda was in the independence movement. And there's been the bringing out of this Hindu voice at a national level in India. But in European countries, they bring out the Pope, they bring out their religious leaders. Islamic countries, they bring out their leaders. So my point is a Hindu voice is necessary, and a Hindu political voice is also necessary because democracy is about the rule of the vote. And so what we've had in the Indian context is that there has not been this deeper awakening of India, because there's been the idea that India should give itself over to current political influences rather than reclaiming its own traditions and its own great teachings at many levels.
Last few questions. The Sangh continues to see India as a Hindu Rashtra. They keep using the appellation Hindu. Should this be avoided? Because we have, around 20% of our population are minorities. There are certain states which are minority dominant, in the Northeast, for example. And those populations might be 1 or 2%. Christians might be 1 or 2% of the Indian population, but they're bigger certainly than a large number of Eastern European countries. So should this word just be parked aside? Because obviously it generates some sort of a reaction.
Well, if it's not set aside, it has to be redefined. Because the idea of a Hindu Rashtra is a dharmic Rashtra. For example, it's also rooted in the earth. You go back to Bhumi Sukta of the Atharva Veda. It's honoring nature. In the Hindu Dharma, we recognize that consciousness exists in all living beings, and that they also have their rights. The ecosystems of nature have their rights. So it's easily prone to misinterpretation, but the basic idea of honoring the land, the culture, we do find, and it has its place. And we do see a civilizational awakening in other ancient cultures. Let me explain that a bit. After the end of World War II and the end of the colonial era, we had a rewriting of history honoring the indigenous cultures of Africa and America. It's still incomplete. But in India, it didn't happen. The colonial anti-India narrative actually got worse under Marxist rule. And the idea of India as a cradle of civilization, as one of the great gurus of the world, even though Indic tradition spread to Japan, China, Central Asia, was kind of put down. And India was looked at according to a post-World War II leftist view, rather than allowed to be itself. So I think we also have to redefine India, Bharata, Bharatiya, in a way that honors the civilization. And you have to remember that we don't have any monolithic majority culture almost anywhere. For example, I think Iran is only 60% Iranian. And we have different cultures in different parts of the world. And we also have an honoring. For example, Narendra Modi has received a lot of respect from Saudi Arabia, from UAE, from Bahrain, from Egypt, Bangladesh. There's no divide there. It's simply based upon religion. And what we find is also that, take in the case of Islamic terrorism, it's also challenged in Islamic countries. It's not something that it's Hindus versus Muslims. So India's view, and then India as a player on the world stage. India is unique in that, perhaps unique along with China, is that its antiquity and its size. Again, India is a larger population, diversity, and much greater history than Europe and North America put together, at least in Europe and North America today. So a new understanding of India, Bharat, Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma needs to also be brought out, and not this idea that Hinduism is a nationalism, Hinduism going to try to control the world. These are the shadows of the Western colonial view. What we've actually seen is, what did India first bring to the world? They brought all the yoga and Vedanta and all of that. They didn't bring all the other stuff that the colonialists did.
The obvious question that flows, Dr. Frawley, is whether Hinduism can be then identified with India only.
Yes, historically, Hinduism was the foundation of many of the countries and cultures, particularly of Southeast Asia. The oldest script of Java is based upon Brahmi. They also have 50% Sanskrit loanwords. We had the Hindu influence in Laos. The largest Hindu temple is Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Throughout that whole region, even the Hindu traders into China. And Buddhism also brought Hindu culture. You can find many Hindu deities in Japan. We also had Hindu influence through the West. The Greeks picked it up. The Romans honored India. They didn't look down upon India. Also through Europe, even before the Christian era, the trade between India as far as Egypt. And today, we have Hindus all over the world, not just the Indians who have moved, but we also, even like myself, we were people from the Western cultural background who picked up the Indic civilization, the Bharatiya in the spiritual sense, and the Hindu Sanatana Dharma. And I've always seen that as Hindu Dharma is very ecological, because it always says to think universally but apply locally. So wherever Hindus go, they also build temples, and wherever groups take up Hindu Dharma, they adapt it. Hinduism says you must adapt your teachings to time, place, and person. Dharma is not a set of dogmas. Dharma means doing what is best possible at any given moment, regardless of the limitations involved. So we must remember the expanse of Sanatana Dharma and not just simply allow Hinduism to be looked at through a narrow political lens, but the fact that Hindus have not voted or not asserted themselves politically, as obviously when they do, that is going to shake the existing vested interest who are going to be unhappy and feel there's something wrong with it.
Well, Dr. Frawley, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I will conclude by just saying, taking off from where Dr. Frawley has ended, let us celebrate our Bhartiyata, our culture, our Hinduness, which is a derivation, or derivative rather, of our culture, because it is rooted in dharma, which has inherently always been pluralistic and inclusive and progressive. Thank you very much.